Hello everyone, we're back in my Game Grid toy box for the final time because today we're going to finish this toy box. But before we do, I want to take a moment and let you know what's coming next. I still have 2 more toy boxes planned for this series, which will wrap up the tutorials for nearly all of the remaining Creativitoys. However, I have a lot going on right now. Next week, I will be finishing my Jurassic Classic racetrack, and then the following week, I'll be starting my new Star Wars series that I previewed on May the 4th, and I need some time to put the finishing touches on that. Also, I'm planning to take a break for most of the month of September, and I'd really like to finish that Star Wars series before my break. So, this seems like a good time to press pause on toy box tutorials. I'll resume this series later in the fall, probably in October or November. But for today, let's finish this toy box. And the last thing we need to do for this final mission is to handle the case where Clue fails to reach the end of the maze. And when that happens, I want to turn off the remote controller down here and have Mickey start over. And because I'm using the ability terminal to spawn the townsperson that we're controlling, Clue, Mickey will need to hack the ability terminal again to lower the force field around the remote controller, which means we need to use the replayer to put that force field back. The problem with that is that when Mickey is controlling Clue, he's standing on top of the remote controller, and when the mission fails and I put the force field back, that means Mickey's going to be trapped inside the force field, and that's going to be a problem, obviously. So I need to move Mickey away from the remote controller before I put that force field back. And fortunately, we have a Creativitoy that we can use to do that. It's the checkpoint, and that's the topic for our lesson for today. You can find this toy in the Creativitoys drawer. And the main purpose for this toy is to change the respawn point after a player dies. You can activate this toy by walking over it or with a logic connection, and then when the player dies, they'll respawn at this location. But you can also use this toy to teleport players to this location, and that's what we're going to do. But before we do anything else, let's take a closer look at this toy. So I'm going to place one out here on the edge of the toy box world, and we'll put down a few buttons that we can use to test the behaviors. So I'll just throw down 5 buttons because we have 5 behaviors. Alright, so the normal default behavior for this toy, when you place it down, it's on by default, and you can see there's a little effect, swirling effect and magical effect on it. When you step on it, you see the little 1 appears, and that means that player 1 has stepped on this, and this is now player 1's default spawn point. So if Mickey were to die, no longer will he appear over at the start pad, way over there in the toy box. Now he'll reappear here, and we can test that easy enough. Woohoo! By having Mickey die, and you can see he respawned. And notice which direction he's facing. The little red dot there on the base of the checkpoint tells you which way the player will be facing. So if you want Mickey to face inward toward the city, you can turn this toy that way, and then Mickey will be respawned facing that direction. So that's kind of important to notice. Let's go ahead and delete that and put a fresh one down. And let's look at the properties for this toy. So there's 4 properties. The first one is default 4, and this will make the checkpoint the default respawn point for whoever you specify. Right now it's none, which means the player has to contact this. They have to walk over it or do something. Something has to happen with this Creativitoy to make this the new default respawn point. So by default it's none, which means if you do nothing with this toy, nothing will happen. the player will continue to respawn over at the starting pad, which again in this toy box is right over here. That's our starting pad. Just so you know what I'm talking about. But you can change that with the property. And so if you don't want to have the player have to touch this, you just want them to automatically spawn at this point, you can select this. By default it's set to none. You can change it to all players or a specific player. So if you want to have player 1 respawn at a specific point and player 2 respawn at a different point, you can do that with 2 different checkpoints. You can place multiple checkpoints in the toy box. You can also do that for teams. So you can make this the default respawn point for the blue team or the orange team or whatever team you want. And again, it's set to none by default. The next property is on contact, set 4. And by default, it's set to individual players. So if player 1, like I did earlier, steps on this toy, it becomes the default for player 1 when he steps on it, when he contacts it, but not for other players. So each individual player has to step on that toy, and on contact it'll become the default respawn point for that player. Again, you can change this, so make it for individual teams, so only one team member has to step on this checkpoint to make it the default respawn point for the entire team. You can also make it for all, so when any player steps on this, all players will respawn at this point. And by default, again, it's individual players. Then we have a property called available for, and by default it's set for all, which means any player can interact with this checkpoint. If you want, you can change that. You can make it none. So if you wanted to, for example, to set this as the default for all players, then they don't need to touch this. And so you can make this available for none, and they don't have to actually touch it. You can also make it specifically for player 1, for example. So it would only be available for player 1. If player 2 stepped on this, nothing would happen. You can also make it available only for specific teams. So you can have certain checkpoints for certain teams. And that can be helpful. There's also a flag called hidden, and by default it's on, which means when the player is out in the toy box world, they can see this toy. And that's useful when you want them to be able to step on it. They'll see that, hey, there's a checkpoint. I want to make sure I respawn at this point, not all the way back at the beginning of the toy box. And so then they run up and step on it. But if you don't want them to be able to see that, you can turn that flag off. And so if we do that, then it's invisible. So that's helpful. Okay, so those are all of the properties. We have one trigger signal, new logic connection, when the checkpoint is set. So this is when a player makes contact with this toy, or a logic connection otherwise, makes this toy the default respawn point for one of the players or teams. In that case, this toy will broadcast this signal, and you can hook this up to let other toys know that this is now the default checkpoint. We also have new path connection. So you can connect the checkpoint to a path and make it move along the path. I thought about why you would want to do this, and the only case I could really think of is for the case where you have a moving platform and you want the player to respawn on that moving platform. So this gives you the opportunity to do that. And then we also have some behaviors for this toy. And so on this first button here, new logic connection when pressed, let's go take a look at those. So there's 5 things you can make this do. You can set this to be the checkpoint, and this overrides the step-on behavior. So you don't have to step on it. You can use a logic connection to make this happen. And if you select that, you can make it the default respawn point for all players or a specific player. Teams are not available, so I don't know why they limited that here, but they did. You can also turn this on or off. By default, it is on. And so let me just go ahead and demo this part. We'll use this button to demo that and make this the default spawn point for player 1. We'll use this one to hook up and turn the checkpoint on. Turning it off, though, makes it no longer available for any player. And so, for example, if we come out over here and we press our third button, which turns it off, watch the toy. You notice the little magical effect went away. So now when I step on this, nothing happens. And nothing's going to happen until I turn it back on. And then the little magical effect appears, and I can step on that and make that my default spawn point. And again, with the first logic connection, I set this first button to do what the same thing would do if I were to step on that. So if we press that, you'll notice the little 1 appears circling over top of that. And so that's now the default checkpoint for player 1, even though I didn't actually step on that toy. So that's what that does. New logic connection when pressed. You can clear the checkpoint for player 1. That undoes what that first button just did. So if I were to come over here and press this, you'll notice the little 1 is now gone. And that works if I step on this toy too. So 1 appears, and then I come down here and turn this off. The little 1 vanished. So that basically clears the checkpoint and resets it. Now the last little trigger signal, or the last little behavior rather, is the one that we're interested in for our mission, and that is teleport player. And you can teleport a specific player to this checkpoint immediately. So when I push that button, player 1, for example, will immediately teleport to that checkpoint, or player 2, or whoever I say. I can set it also for all players, or a specific team, or just the triggering player. So if we say, for example, player 1, then when I come over and push the button, now Mickey appears on top of the checkpoint. Took a moment for that to happen, but I pressed that to clear it. So you can do some interesting things there by making the button available and having the triggering player move, or having a button that only player 1 can get to that will put player 2 on that checkpoint. So you can use that to move other players around and create some really interesting gameplay. So that is our checkpoint. And let's just go ahead and delete all of these things, because I think we get the idea of what this toy can do. And now that we know what it can do, let's finish up our little mission here. And, one more thing I wanted to point out. I'll rotate this that way so Mickey will be facing this way. Again, you can have multiple checkpoints in the toy box. And if you do that and you place more than one in here, only one checkpoint can be active for a player at any given time. And so, for example, I'll just drop down 2 of them over here. So if Mickey steps on this one, this is now the default respawn point for player 1. If I step on this one, you'll see the 1 is now on here and it disappeared from the other one. So only one of these checkpoints can be active for a player at a given time. You can only have one default respawn point for a player. So that's important to know. They're kind of mutually exclusive. And that's true whether you step on them or you try to programmatically set them with a logic connection. Alright, so now that we've seen what this toy can do, let's try it out. And again, we're going to use it in our mission to move Mickey off of the remote controller when Clue fails and the mission is reset. So we need the checkpoint for that, and we need a couple of other toys also. We're going to put down another trigger area. And we're going to put this one underneath the terrain for the maze. And we'll place this like that. And I'm going to grab this, and we're going to stretch this out. We want to leave enough room here around the perimeter of this so that, so that when Clue falls off of here, or he's knocked off by one of the hammers or this spinning hazard, the spiked blades, then he'll fall, and he'll fall through this trigger area. So this trigger area will tell us when the mission has failed, because the only way Clue can enter this trigger area is if he falls off the maze. And when that happens, we want to do a number of things. Again, we want to turn off the remote controller. We want to fail the mission and reset it so that Mickey has to start over. And so on here, we're going to need that. We also need another time delayer. So let me pick this one up from last time and put it back. And we'll drop a fresh one right over here next to our logic gate. This logic gate we put down last time so that when the player finishes the maze, we automatically turn off all the weather vanes. This trigger area needs to do the exact same thing, and I could make 4 logic connections to those weather vanes for that, just like I would have had to do for that. But because we routed this through this logic gate to do that, that means I only have to make 1 connection here on this trigger area. So we'll do a new logic connection when entered by AI friend. So Clue has basically fallen off the maze. First thing will come up here to our logic gate and input, and that will output to all of the weather vanes. So with 1 logic connection, we are turning off all of those weather vanes. So that's really good. That resets those. Next thing we want to do on the trigger area for when Clue fails, new logic connection when entered by AI friend. We want to come up to our remote controller and for player 1 we want to force exit. That'll bring Mickey up out of here or back into this area of the toy box, and also turn off the target camera down here that was looking at Clue, because we made that connection earlier, a couple episodes ago. Alright, on the failure trigger area, new logic connection when entered by AI friend. I'm going to go ahead and remove Clue. So we'll come over to our friend generator and remove all. And I could just wait for him to fall all the way to his death, but this is just a little bit cleaner, I think. And a new logic connection when entered by AI friend. We need to come back up to our ability terminal and reset it. And again, we do that with the activate signal. That turns it back on. And because that's back on, we need to restore our force field. So a new logic connection when entered by AI friend. We will come up to our replayer and do a playback. And then to get the player out of the force field, we need to interact with this checkpoint. And so for that, come down to our trigger area, new logic connection when entered by AI friend. Again, all of these things happen when clue falls through this trigger area. We'll come up to our checkpoint, and we will teleport player 1 to this point. That puts Mickey on there looking that way. And you saw there was a little bit of a delay when we do that with the logic connection. And so that's why I set up the time delayer down here. So on the properties for that, we're going to set the delay time. I think 2 seconds is probably enough. We could set that to 3 if we need to. But I want to kind of have a sound effect play to let the player know the mission failed, and have Mickey kind of cry about it. So on our trigger area we just added earlier, new logic connection when entered by AI friend. We'll come up to our time delayer, which will give 2 seconds for all of those things to happen. And then on the time delayer, a new logic connection when the delay is completed. We'll come over to our action enforcer and have all the players lament. And on that time delayer, a new logic connection when the delay is completed. We'll come up to our sound effect generator and play a failure sound. So under the musical category, the one I kind of like for a cartoony toy box like this is the funny failure. That's kind of a nice little wah, wah, wah. I like that. Okay, and that is everything, I believe. Just double checking my notes. Yeah. So let's go ahead and try it out. Oh, and one other thing. Let's set the properties for this toy. I knew I was forgetting something. So on the checkpoint, I'm going to set this to none and individual players and all is fine. We'll go ahead and hide this because the player doesn't need to know that that's there. And that will remove it. And sometimes you can see that when you're in the editor. But if you come out of the editor, now it's invisible. Okay, one final time. Let's go ahead and hack the terminal. And we're only testing the failure case today because we already know the other case works. Alright, so the force field should be down. We can step on the remote controller. Alright, and then we will press X on my controller to move Snow White going up, and I will just let her continue going up. And let her go right off the end of that.
That's okay. I still had fun.
So there we go. So we got Mickey out of the force field, and so now he can go over here and do the mission again. So there we go. And again, before you go through and run that mission and actually finish it and complete it, you want to make sure you save your toy box, because once the theme changer takes effect, the whole toy box changes, and that's not good. You'll lose a lot of work if you do that. So I mentioned that last time. Alright, one last thing we're going to do. In the little playthrough that I did a few episodes ago, you may remember I had some enemies here at the start of this. So when Mickey came into the city, I put a few enemies here. So let's go ahead and just set that up. And we've done this a few times before, but this is a tutorial series, so I don't want to skip anything. But what I did for that, we have a dynamic trigger and an enemy wave generator, and we're going to place some locators in here. And we're going to count off from this end these little stripes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're going to place the first one right about here. And I want the little blue dot on that side to be facing out that way, because the player will be entering the city from that direction. And we'll place a few more of these in here. We'll place one here, one back over here, and another one off over here. We're just going to spread the enemies out. And we'll connect up our dynamic trigger with a new locator connection to this locator. And we'll connect the enemy wave generator up to all of them. I just thought it'd be really nice to have some enemies kind of greet you as you come into the city. Because if Mickey's enemy here, this computer system, has turned his world into a video game, we don't know why it did that, but you'd assume it wouldn't be happy about Mickey trying to put it back. So it should put up a little resistance. And having a few enemies here will make that happen. So on our enemy wave generator, we'll configure the wave. And because this is a Disney toy box, kind of cartoony, I chose to use some of the Stitch's Tropical Rescue enemies. And we'll use 4 of them. And under the properties, we'll take the generation delay to 0, and all the rest of those will leave the way they are. And we're going to use this dynamic trigger so that when the player enters the radius that we're going to set around this locator, we'll generate the enemies. And so on the dynamic trigger, under the properties, the target is going to be the connected locator. Oops, not the connected actor. The locator. And the trigger distance, I'm going to set this to be 50. So on the dynamic trigger, a new logic connection, when entered by player, any, will generate our wave. And we only want to do this one time. So on the enemy wave generator, a new logic connection, when the wave is generated, we'll turn around and turn off the dynamic trigger. And with the locator sitting here, a radius of 50 puts it out about this far or so. And so when Mickey spawns here at this point, facing that direction, he's probably going to go play those games or whatever. But if he turns around and heads into the city, then we want to kind of block his path a little bit with those enemies. And so that's what we do there. Well, I think that's everything that I wanted to cover with the checkpoint. And that will actually generate those enemies. I set myself down in the wrong spot. Whoa!
Wow! And now I'm gonna be unstoppable!
I leveled up. Oh, make sure I get my sparks. So anyway, that's everything I wanted to cover for the checkpoint. If you want to see another example of how to use this toy, check out my Player Battles mini-series, where I show you how to use a series of checkpoints so that when a player is killed, they'll respawn in a random location. Well, that's all for me today. Thank you for watching, and have a nice weekend.